The Americans arrived on April 29, 1945, during the end of the evacuations from the camp. While advancing towards one of the darkest places in occupied Europe, they came across a transport with 4,000 prisoners, which they failed to intercept in time, and which continued towards Germany. After this incident, the Americans decided to pick up the pace. The 42nd and 45th Infantry Divisions covered 60 kilometers along the Danube, arriving much earlier than Hitler's troops expected. It was Sunday noon, the camp was completely quiet, and the SS guards were on duty, monitoring the movements of the prisoners still in the camp from their towers. A heartrending cry broke the calm of the day: "The Americans! The Americans!" A prisoner ran towards the door, in a vain attempt to attract the attention of the soldiers, but one of the guards shot him in the back, killing him instantly. Either way, it wasn't necessary. The US infantry had caught sight of the Dachau towers, and began firing at the German officers. The SS members, finding themselves vastly outnumbered, decided to step down from their posts and surrender unconditionally. After the first two guards knelt, an American soldier approached and, without a second thought, executed them on the spot using his pistol. Thus would begin a bloody day, remembered as one of the greatest war crimes of the United States during World War II. Join us in a new episode of Military History to learn all about the terrible Dachau Massacre, when American soldiers mercilessly murdered German prisoners of war. But before continuing, we want to introduce you to our new channel, Military Might. Here we'll explore the extraordinary world of the armed forces, armored vehicles, weapons of mass destruction, and the most important military conflicts of today. You'll find the link to subscribe in the description of the video and in the first comment. Are you ready? Let's get started. Captain Wilsey believed he was prepared for anything. He was part of the 7th Army of the United States, and had even participated in the landing in Normandy. As an anesthesiologist, a fundamental part of the medical corps, he witnessed the harshest images of the battle. Since entering Europe, he had assisted thousands of fallen soldiers, with the most terrible injuries, although most of them died clinging to the anesthesiologist's hand, while feeling the warm embrace of morphine as the last relief. Captain Wilsey believed that he was prepared for anything, that he had already seen the greatest atrocities of the war, until he entered Dachau. As soon as he passed through the barred portals that separated barbarism from the rest of the world, he could not help but remain motionless while he traversed the sinister panorama. Piles of skeletal corpses, a mixture of death caused by malnutrition with long exposure to the elements and the sun during decomposition. Piles of shoes and prisoner uniforms accumulated in sheds, which had just been removed from those sentenced to death, to be reused in the next litter of inmates who entered the camp. The ovens where they burned the bodies of the victims and removed the evidence of the genocide smoked at full speed. But even worse was with the living. The remaining prisoners, more than 30,000 people who were in subhuman conditions, looked like the walking dead. Completely devastated by starvation and lack of water, toothless due to poor sanitation and lack of personal hygiene rooms. Wilsey, like his American colleagues, could not really understand how such a scenario could possibly exist anywhere in the world. Somehow, the captain understood what his companions did the days following April 29, 1945, although the whole situation left him with serious psychological consequences that accompanied him for the rest of his days. But thanks to him, today we know the details of what is known as the Dachau Massacre. The massacre began, as we mentioned before, with the first guards who surrendered in the face of the arrival of the 2 battalions of U.S. infantry. But this had been an isolated incident, until the Americans finally entered the camp. Tower B, the second lookout post, was also the scene of a systematic shooting of German guards who, after surrendering, were forced to kneel and shot in the head. Lieutenant Walsh captured 4 German soldiers, forced them into a freight car containing some 120 Jewish corpses, and, after keeping them there for a while, murdered them in cold blood. Some 12 POWs were later gunned down in a coal yard by a 19-year-old gunner, who was found by Colonel Sparks in deep shock, crying and screaming that they had tried to escape.
Before the end of the first day, madness gripped the men at Dachau.
After a long time, towards the end of his life, Wilsey attributed the macabre events to a kind of delirium tremens. According to him, the horrors that the American soldiers had to witness, added to the stress of the war, were too much for them. On the morning of the second day, the Americans forced some 50 SS soldiers to strip naked in the open and give the Nazi salute, arm raised to the sun, while buckets of ice water were thrown at them. This practice had been carried out by the guards themselves with the Jews and other prisoners previously. However, there was the condition that if they lowered their arms for whatever reason, they would be executed. The 50 Germans were shot to death before noon. In letters from the date of the events, the anesthesiologist spoke of the massacre as something logical. In one of his letters you can read, "I saw how my companions captured an SS soldier who had been tortured and then coldly shot him. God forgive me, but I watched it without being disturbed by emotion after knowing the actions that the beasts of the SS had carried out against their prisoners." Really, he wasn't the only one who had this in mind. Some members of the 7th Army of the United States, invoking a certain spirit of revenge, decided to give their rifles to the Jews in better health, so that they could guard the German prisoners in the way they saw fit. The men, who had been dehumanized, abused, tortured and humiliated for so long, soon unleashed a small carnage. They entered the camp hospital, where they murdered dozens of SS officers, as well as conventional German troops. They also directed their hatred against the capos, other prisoners who had higher status and wielded the power of guards among the prisoners themselves. Many of them were beaten to death or executed in the barracks. Within days, the Dachau Massacre had been consummated. Although the official figures, accepted by the United States government, suggest that the German prisoners killed were between 50 and 100, some other sources indicate that they could have reached more than 500. General Eisenhower celebrated the liberation of the camp and reported that 32,000 prisoners had been released, while U.S. troops had killed some 300 enemies. The conditions in which these deaths occurred, however, became known almost 70 years later. And now, after going through all the details about the Dachau Massacre, we want to know your opinion. Do you think that the actions of the American soldiers were justified by the brutalities they had to witness, or was this a war crime? Leave your answer in the comment box below and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history. This was all in a new episode of Military History. Thank you very much for joining us until the end.